So, good afternoon. We are now coming to the end of our ICA22, and we are going to have now our last plenary session with Richard Shusterman and Molefi Asanti. The moderation is going to be by Fiona Hughes. And before we start with the very academic work, I'd like to say some words of gratefulness that you came. We all evaluate it as a very successful event, and it was so because of your presence here. I hope you all enjoyed. There were people coming from all parts of Brazil and 20, if I can really remember, 26 countries. Yeah, it's very significant. And we had the opportunity to discuss in the highest level some of the most important issues concerning aesthetics in the contemporary world. So I thank you very much, and I give the word to my friend Fiona Hughes.
Hi. Just before we start this really exciting and important session, I just want to say, like I know all of you will want to say, thank you to Rodrigo.
Yes.
And Rodrigo, of course, is right, as he's always right, and always generous. He's right to say, and to all of his team as well. So, I'm delighted, honoured to be asked to chair this final main session, not the final sessions, because there are more parallels afterwards, but this final session on Friday afternoon of this wonderful conference. And the first speaker is Richard Shusterman, who is the Dorothy F. Schmidt Eminent Scholar in the Humanities and Director of the Centre for Body, Mind and Culture at Florida Atlantic University. After earning a BA and MA in philosophy from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a doctorate in philosophy from Oxford, he was tenured in Israel before continuing his academic career in the USA. Besides his many years as a professor and then chair of the philosophy department at Temple University, he has had visiting appointments in Paris, Berlin, Rome, Hiroshima, and Shanghai. Shusterman is a much translated author, and his pragmatic aesthetics, just for example, is published in 15 different languages. And he is, as many of you will already know, the initiator of Somaesthetics, which he is going to be talking about today. He has also won many awards and orders throughout the world. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Richard today, and we will all be looking forward to what he has to say.
It's good to be back in Brazil. It's my third time. It's the end of a very long conference, not quite the end, but I'm sure everyone's tired. So I will try to keep my discourse short and not read from a paper. As someone who was a foreign student and foreign teacher in different lands, I realized that it's often very difficult to follow a paper that's read very quickly. So I thought it would be easier to have a PowerPoint and speak freely. Part of Somaesthetics is being comfortable. So this is why I'm standing, because as an academic, we all sit too much. So if anyone wants to stand, they're welcome. If anyone wants to leave because they're tired, you're welcome as well. And I will try to deal with the technology. I have a screen here, but I think what's happening over there is important and decisive, since I'm not controlling the screen. Or I am, but with this device, which works. Okay, so what you're going to have here is some old stuff and some new stuff. The old to make you feel comfortable with familiarity, and the new, which is probably also new to the Brazilians and many others, because that work with the man in gold has not yet been translated except in, well, it's in French, English, and Chinese. So I'll also be talking about that because it's a way that Somaesthetics goes from philosophy, which was my core discipline, into the world of art and performance, which I feel increasingly comfortable with. So, what is Somaesthetics? Well, let's see. That's a summary definition, and you can read it. It's an interdisciplinary field of theory and practice. Maybe it's good that I see what's happening there. And there you have the theory of practice. It's ameliorative. It doesn't try to simply describe things. It tries to improve them. And that's the pragmatist dimension of Somaesthetics. So those are the general aims. The covers, actually, there's a Brazilian cover there, the Consciência Corporal. The general aims are beyond philosophical discourse. Thank you. In my past, I was an officer in the Army, so I think my voice can carry without the microphone. But for the sake of recording, which has overtaken the importance of presence in our lives, I hope the other microphone will pick up my voice. So we live through our bodies. Everything we do through the soma. And so there are general aims besides philosophy in Somaesthetics. Because the soma reaches out into all dimensions of life, Somaesthetics, although initially I conceived it as a branch of aesthetics in 1999, it developed and blossomed and burgeoned into an interdisciplinary field. And the importance of the interdisciplinarity is to cover the very many discourses that exist that are concerned with care and improvement and difficulties of the body. So why did I think it was necessary? Two reasons. One, because in the humanities, there wasn't a conceptual umbrella, architectonic and overarching conceptual framework to connect all sorts of different body practices, from the East, from the West, the more medical-oriented, the more artistically oriented. And so part of the idea of Somaesthetics is to provide an interdisciplinary field or architectonic structure, conceptual structure, where these different discourses can interact and dialogue with each other more fruitfully. The other difficulty that I found when I started thinking about this topic in the 1990s was that in the humanities, we didn't have any practical teaching of somatic exercises. And I remember, Molefi is here, so I can tell a temple story. You know, when I was working at temple we have an excellent dance department, a PhD department. I had a lot of dancers who came to my seminars, and they, in fact, were inspirations for me. But when they would come to visit me at the department, it was very much frowned on by my colleagues, especially because they came in sweatpants or leotards, and that wasn't felt appropriate. And the idea that I would actually teach body exercises in the philosophy department was outre and out of consideration, and actually that's one of the reasons I moved to a general humanities chair in Florida. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said that he left the ministry in order to be a better minister. And so I feel that I left the philosophy department to be a better philosopher, because it allows you the freedom to explore things that in academic philosophy, very difficult to explore. Okay, so these are some of the general values of somaesthetic cultivation: improving our action, which we do with the soma, improving our knowledge and our pleasure, environmental understanding. We're much more sensitive to pollution. We're much more concerned about the quality of water if we can taste the difference. We can also enjoy ourselves without leaving a huge carbon footprint if we know how to take pleasure in simple bodily things like breathing, stretching, walking, etc. Social understanding and interaction. Why do all the rational arguments against racism and ethnic animosity and discrimination always convince on the intellectual level, but don't change the roots of the animosity and the prejudice and discrimination? It's because the source of that animosity is not a rational one, it's a visceral one. And one of the goals of somaesthetics is to try to make people aware of their bodily, subtle, unconscious prejudice against people who look, act, and smell and walk different. Because until you know what disturbing feelings those people arouse in you, you are unable to control those disturbing feelings. So somaesthetics has an important role in racism, homophobia, and similar sorts of things. Okay, the genealogy of somaesthetics. Somaesthetics came from two main sources of research in my background. The first was pragmatist aesthetics, and the second is the idea of philosophy as a way of life, philosophy as a practice. So pragmatist aesthetics, you have John Dewey and William James there, but the main idea here is that since we need our soma both to create art and to appreciate art, ceteris paribus, if we have better knowledge and control of our soma, we can both create and appreciate art in a better way. Even with respect to being able to practice longer. Many musicians have limits in their ability to practice because they have a body posture that involves tension and pain, and so they get tired after a while and have to stop. Okay. Not a very important slide for many people, but for some people may be important. What's the difference between somaesthetics and live phenomenology, or Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of the body, which I greatly admire and from which I've learned a great deal? I think there are three differences. One is somaesthetics is very attentive to the different somas that people have in different times, in different places, at different ages. The bodily experience of a 3-year-old is different from the bodily experience of a 25-year-old, which is different from the bodily experience of a 90-year-old. And to generalize about the relationship of the human body to the world in general, for all people at all times, the way Merleau-Ponty did, is not something that I found adequate, nor did the feminist philosophers find that adequate. The second difference is, instead of a descriptive philosophical account of embodiment, Somaesthetics urges for a melioristic transformation to something more positive. Now, things begin with description, but they don't end there. And the third point is that it involves particular practices to actually affect that improvement. Okay, the second general source of Somaesthetics is the idea of philosophy as an art of living. And here you have the famous picture of Socrates taking the hemlock. And one of the interesting things about Western philosophy is that there's a big strain of hero worship where the hero kind of dies in defense of philosophy. So philosophy for many centuries, in fact, Montaigne is still speaking about it, is the idea of philosophy as learning how to die. Because your death, in terms of the Greek tradition, was extremely important because it was a test of whether you could really walk the walk as a philosopher and not talk the talk. Perhaps Socrates' greatest argument for the belief in immortality of the soul is the calm with which he took or let his own life pass away. Montaigne, it's a picture of him from, it's near the Musée du Moyen Âge in Paris. Montaigne brought a different idea, that philosophy should be not about how to die and to prepare yourself for death, but how to live. And this idea, of course, has been taken up by Pierre Hadot and Michel Foucault. And originally I was going to give a new paper about that, but I thought that's something to read with no images. And I think images are important at the end of the conference. So these are some of the goals, the old philosophical goals of philosophy that Somaesthetics can address. And I won't go into explaining them here. Now, when I introduced Somaesthetics in the late 90s, I described it, and I still describe it, as a new name for some old ways of thinking. When William James introduced pragmatism, although it was earlier introduced by C.S. Peirce, but James in his book, Pragmatism, described the book as a subtitle, Pragmatism, a New Name for Some Old Ways of Thinking. And there's nothing really in Somaesthetics that you can't find a bit, an element here or there in previous philosophical thinking. It's just, there's value in a name and in a concept because it helps bring things together that otherwise would be left apart and not in dialogue. So Baumgarten, the founder of aesthetics, was very important for me and for Somaesthetics in the sense that he returned or he originated aesthetics not as a theory of beauty or a philosophy of art, but a philosophy of perception. And Somaesthetics goes back to the Baumgarten idea of aesthetics, the original defining idea of aesthetics, as a theory and practice of improving our sensory perception. The problem was that Baumgarten thought of sensory perception in the rationalist Leibnizian tradition as something that the mind does and the body doesn't. The body is just like a mechanical camera, and it's the mind that does the connection of the images that the bodily senses bring. The soma is something different. The soma is something that's both, in dualistic terms, object and subject. The soma is an embodied subjectivity. And so, ontologically speaking, body and mind for Somaesthetics are one thing. It's just we have different discourses about that one thing. The idea can be traced back to Spinoza. Okay, so another source of Somaesthetics that was important for me was the East Asian tradition. So the soma in Chinese, you have a very nice term, shenti, which has both the body and the mind. Originally, in ancient Chinese, you only used the first character, hanse, or kanji in Chinese. And some people think that that first character is based on the idea of a pregnant woman. It's kind of, the front is big, and they have two thin legs. So East Asian thought, whether it's Confucianism or Taoism or Buddhism, recognizes the spiritual energy and power of embodiment and doesn't reject bodily practices from the philosophical life. So there I am in a Taoist temple in Taishan in China. Okay, so Somaesthetics for me was also a solution to a design problem that I had. And I wanted to talk about embodied aesthetics, but I didn't want to talk about aesthetics of the body, because immediately that idea calls up images of bodybuilders and top models and beauty pageants and all the horrible things that our neoliberal capitalist society makes us miserable about in order to sell more products of how to be prettier, younger, thinner, etc. So I didn't like the word body for body aesthetics, not only because of that reason, but because in our Western tradition, body is contrasted with mind and soul. Body can be the corpse. Body, if you're a good Catholic, you know, it's the center of sin, you know, the carnality. And so I didn't want to use the word body. So I went back to the Greek word soul. I had another problem. As I was introduced, I learned aesthetics in Jerusalem. Jerusalem and Israel for a long time was a colonial, colonized country. We were colonized under the British mandate, and our English was British English. And so I learned to write aesthetics with an A-E, with a diphthong. That was fun. When I did my PhD at Oxford, and Fiona can testify to the British spelling of aesthetics, it's also with the diphthong, A. I had a problem when I moved to the United States and became a pragmatist. John Dewey writes aesthetics only with an E. All the European languages just have an E. Should I go and follow John Dewey, whom I greatly admired, particularly also in his aesthetic theory, or should I be stubborn about my earlier training? And then there's another issue, and that's the ecological and also the logical one. You know, we learned, at least I learned in my education, Occam's razor, you know, get rid of unnecessary things. Well, the A doesn't do any work. You don't hear it, it doesn't change the meaning, it's just there as an ornament. So it's also like wasteful. Just think of the extra paper and ink you use each time you write aesthetics. So I had a kind of dilemma between, and this dilemma has been the subject of a cartoon by, an artistic illustration by Sol Steinberg. And this is like a big, clunky, clumsy E dreaming that he's an elegant So there was a dilemma, you know? logic and efficiency or beauty? And as someone who likes to integrate the two, that the logical and the efficient and the clean and the non-ornamental is more beautiful, I had a real dilemma. There you see the dilemma, and you'll see now the solution. Somaesthetics was the solution. Because with the soma, the A has a point. So, it's true that that was one of my motivations. And, it's a motivation that aestheticians should understand. Okay, so I'll go quickly through the three branches of somaesthetics. One is more descriptive. It's about how our bodily perceptions and practices work and through which we perceive the world, but also our particular norms and ideals of beauty as they change over history. The second branch, pragmatic somaesthetics, is about methodologies to improve our bodily experience. Now, obviously, those methodologies presupposes facts about the body that analytic somaesthetics deals with, but it's normative in that it tries to change the facts. And a lot of the area of pragmatic somaesthetics is also debates about the values that are implied in programs, regimes to improve the body, because any idea of improvement implies what constitutes an improvement, and that already introduces a normative dimension and debates about those norms and values. The third branch is practical somaesthetics, and that's different from the pragmatic because it's not about formulating, studying, analyzing, criticizing techniques, but it's actually performing the techniques. So there's a difference between writing a book of yoga, reading a book of yoga, analyzing a book of yoga, and actually doing it. And for the Academy, I thought it was important to mention this as a full-fledged branch, because otherwise no one would engage it. So practical somaesthetics is actually disciplined bodywork. Okay, besides those three branches, there are three main dimensions. One is representational, that's about body representations, not only visual, it can be having a nice aroma, it can be sound, and the second one is experiential. That's not about how things look, but how they feel. And the experiential was very important in the development of somaesthetics because it is a counter and a refutation of critique that I got from people in the Frankfurt School, that somaesthetics is only about beautiful people and strong people and doesn't have anything of value for people who are interested in being blonde, tall, and muscular. Now, there are connections between experiential somaesthetics and representational somaesthetics because sometimes you begin a regime, a technique, for representational aims, and you end up continuing for experiential ones. So there's the sad case of, usually it's women, who want to become thinner, and from the experience of dieting, they end up becoming anorexic, and they can be very, very thin, but still enjoy the feelings of hunger and control of hunger. You can give a more masculine example, although there are very great female bodybuilders, but I'll take a masculine example. There are people who do bodybuilding in order to have like a bigger chest, bigger biceps, but then they continue with this because of the experiential feelings that they get through the pump and other sorts of physiological effects. The third one, as I'm going quickly, I could give more examples of the relationship, is performative. And that's not how something looks or how something feels, but as a result of the performance. And I can give a very simple example that distinguishes between the three. Think of tennis. I mean, we had Wimbledon recently. I think we're coming up to the US Open. So think of a stroke in tennis. A stroke can look very good, right? But not necessarily feel very good. A stroke can feel very good to the person who's making the stroke, but not necessarily look very good. Finally, a stroke can neither look good nor feel good, but it can make a point if it goes inside the line. So that's a simple illustration of the differences, and they're all connected in a way. There are other distinctions between atomistic and holistic. There's some things that you do to yourself, with yourself. You can practice Tai Chi by yourself, but there are other things that you do to other people. So, an Alexander teacher gives a lesson to another person. There are certain things that can be both self-directed and other-directed. You can massage somebody else. You can also massage yourself. But those aren't so important. So this is a structure. That's the branches. Those are the three dimensions, and there are connections between those dimensions. And okay. And those are connections. I see this slide is long and complicated, but all those arrows and connections I could take at least 2 hours explaining. So the best thing is to go on and talk about how Somaesthetics is taught, both through texts, which you can read about it, but also through workshops. So this is a workshop that I gave for dancers from the French choreographer Maggie Morin in Lyon. This is a different workshop that I gave for choreographers and dancers in Paris, in Royaumont. So if there was sound, you could hear my instructions, but they're in French anyhow. And what you see, there should be movement. What you should see is that how you turn by using the gravity and your body weight. So this is how to turn gracefully. It's a very good exercise, actually, not for dancers, for dancers as well, but practically for obese older people who have trouble turning over in bed. And this is a way that without a lot of physical force, by aligning yourself properly, you can do the turn. So here you'll see the person going back, you bring the leg up, and then the weight of the leg brings you to the other side. All right. So these are some of the interdisciplinary applications, but now I'll move on to something different. I often teach in art venues, art schools, particularly in Europe, not so much in the United States. The artists always ask me, the art students, what's the connection between Somaesthetics and contemporary art? And I can give them a long and convincing answer, but it doesn't really interest them. They want something concrete. So I decided, since I know artists in Paris and elsewhere, that if I have an opportunity to work with someone in the arts, I would do it. And it so happened that the Parisian artist, Yann Thomas, who's a full-fledged artist, but also a professor of art at the Sorbonne, he decided that since he knows that I'm a philosopher of experience, and for those of you who know French, expérience is different a bit from the English experience. It has the idea of experimentation and maybe even a bit of transgression. So he decided that he would try to see if he could convince me to wear the costume of his father, who was one of the danseurs principaux, the main dancer of the Paris Opera Ballet in the 1950s and 60s. And so we were in Royaumont, which is a medieval abbey around 50 kilometers north of Paris in the Val d'Oise, a very beautiful part of France, where Claude Manet did a lot of his pretty pictures. And Jan pulled out this, in French it's called a combinaison, this unitard, and asked me to get into it. Well, I didn't think I could, psychologically or physically, but Jan is a friend, and friends for me count for something. So I put it on, and we began to work together. Initially, from this work, there was a bilingual book, French and English, published in Paris, The Adventures of the Man in Gold. There's a Chinese translation as well with the illustrations. There's a second edition in France, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So this is the first night that we did this. So the idea, what are those lines? Those lines are the traces of Jan's lamp. This is a form of photography that was invented by Man Ray. And the way it works is total darkness, the subject strikes a pose, the camera is on a tripod on a slow exposure, the photographer, Jan in this case, he opens the shutter, then comes around very quickly and traces my energy. Jan, besides being an artist, he's a spiritualist. He believes that people have aura. And so his idea is to trace the auratic energy of the subjects. And he thinks that the aura is stronger if one wears non-conventional clothes. And particularly the gold. The gold has a lot of metaphorical, symbolic power. And so this is the beginning of the night where I began posing. But by the end of the night, I was wasted. We were guests of the Abbey. The Abbey is owned by a very wealthy French family. We were guests for the weekend. We worked, we had dinner, we came back to the dungeon, the dark dungeon, where we did the photography at 11 o'clock. By 1 a.m., I was tired. And so you see that, can I go backwards? Yeah, okay. So this is earlier. I have a very young, strong posture. Then, if you look at it, it's a much more yin, feminine posture. You see like curves and vulnerability. And so it's very interesting. This was the first time we worked together. Jan felt uncomfortable coming close to my body, the way he did in the other one. And so he did what in philosophy we call semantic ascent. He went from a real physical thing to a concept and wrote song. We woke up the next day and Jan dragged me back to the studio. Artists, particularly good artists, but I think most artists are passionate and relentless in what they do. And so he said, okay, we did some great work, we've got to do some more. So I guess from 10 a.m. to around 1 p.m. we worked, and I couldn't stand it anymore. As I was introduced, I'm someone who studied in Jerusalem but spent most of his life on the beach in Tel Aviv. I moved to Florida because I like the sunshine, and I couldn't stand being in the dark anymore. And so I just started climbing up the walls. And I finally broke out and just ran out into the alley. I couldn't take it. And so Jan followed me with a movie camera. And that's how the second genre of our work together came about. Now, this was a big event because what happened was, maybe in the spiritualist, Abbey, religious environment, maybe for some other reasons, we had a very nice talk on Tuesday evening by Tanya Rivera about art and madness. You know, there is a connection. And what you can see here is I suddenly began channeling Nijinsky and all the dance that I do. And so here you see me kind of, taking care of the garden. I will go quickly, I have 5 minutes. Here you see the doubling of the self, visually. There was Richard Shusterman, but suddenly there's another person, the man in gold. Now, how did he get his name? When I ran out, I roved around in the garden, I met the tourists who had come to visit the Abbey, and suddenly we realized we were guests for the Sunday lunch. It started at 1 o'clock. And Jan said, it's too late to go back to the studio and get into your clothes. Come as you are. So when I entered, the owner of the Abbey, she just cried out, Lomano, which is, you know, the man in gold, and that's how he got his name. He was born and baptized in a very beautiful religious place where King Louis, who became Saint Louis, used to watch the Mass. Okay, so now you have some images of Lamanor. I'll go quickly. He's only been 2 times in art venues because his idea is to do art outside the official artwork. This is a big part of my work in pragmatist aesthetics, connecting art and life. This was the opening of an art show in Paris to mark the 20th anniversary of the French edition of pragmatist aesthetics. Here, the man in gold is walking in the Parisian streets. Children like him, adults, not so much. Here he comes, you know, in his flying saucer. Here, this is in Paris along the Seine. Those of you who can recognize the Seine, that's Notre Dame de Paris. South America. This is Cartagena. The man in gold had an adventure in Cartagena. I don't have time to go into a very funny story about that, but maybe among the questions. Here he is also in Cartagena, in dialogue with a botero, a Saturday night. The combinaison, the unitard, was made for the Paris Opera stage, not to climb the ramparts of Cartagena. So this is work we did in Denmark. I can talk about that. This is with, these are images from the book. Now, coming to a conclusion, the relationship between me and the man in gold is complex. Here is the man in gold wondering what happened to Richard Shusterman. He's looking at the jeans. Actually, this is new. I mean, those things are from 2012. This is from March in New York City, 23rd Street subway. The man in gold wanted to enjoy New York. Here he is in the subway. New York, and it's different. It's like the psychogeography of different places, parts of New York. The man in gold gets different vibrations. Here he is in Central Park. Yeah, that's still from March. And actually, I'll close with a short clip. It's a clip from one of the films. We have maybe like 10 films about the work of the man in gold. I'm sorry that there's no sound, because the soundtrack is interesting. No dialogue. The man in gold is the philosopher without words. He only expresses himself through gesture, and he follows Lao Tzu, who said, "He who knows does not speak, he who speaks does not know." So I will close with this, and let's see if it...
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'd all like it.
That's all right. You can,
Oh, sorry.
we can let people, it's only a minute.
Oh.
That's... Oh, now there's sound. Now, I actually fell during this. It's sometimes very difficult. I didn't do it on purpose, but that's what happens. Fortunately, I know how to do a judo roll. So, but the next morning was very difficult. Okay. Thank you very much. I finished before my time, and that's something I think I learned in the army.
Thank you so much, Richard. I think what we're going to do, if it's okay, particularly with Molefi, that we're going to continue on the next talk. That's what we've been doing in the other sessions. Sure. So what we'll do is in a moment or two we'll continue directly on to the second speaker today, and then we'll have questions to both speakers during the final session. So we'll just give them a moment or two.
Microphone to Asante, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Acabou de entrar.
Sim. Se você quiser. Vou falar.
Yeah. While we wait for Molefi, I'd like to inform and to remember that after the parallel sessions we are going to have after this plenary session, we are going to have, it should be the general meeting, an assembly of the IAA, but normally these assemblies are, intend to elect a new board and so on. Because of the pandemic and the fact that we had to postpone the Congress for a year, we did this election last year. It was when I was elected the new president of the IAA. So we are not going to have elections, but we should perhaps maintain this a more informal meeting after the parallel sessions. I think it's going to be
6:20.
6:20, okay. Yeah, two more informal and informative conversation about the IAA membership and other questions, okay? For those who are interested, we are still left some materials, mainly the book of abstracts, but also some other material, for instance, the specs,
The programs.
program, and so on. So the ones who want to bring to home some materials could,
Please find me and I'll.
Fernanda will take care of that to give you material. We have already given some abstract books for people who are bound to give in the libraries of their universities or institutions and so on. I think it's a good idea. It is everything in English, so we don't have the problem of language, and so they are available for those who want to bring them home. Okay, so I give back the words to Fiona. And I'd like once again, because I think we have now all the organizing committee. I'd like to thank them very much for the amazing work we have done. And also, the staff, the personnel were helping us. Okay, I'm going to give the word to Fiona, please.
So I'm delighted now again to introduce Molefi KETE Ashanti, who is professor in the Department of Africology at Temple University in Philadelphia. He's the president of the Molefi KETE Ashanti Institute for Afrocentric Studies and professor extraordinarius at the University of South Africa. He's the founding editor of the Journal of Black Studies and the first director of UCLA's Center for Afro-American Studies. Ashanti has published more than 500 articles and is considered one of the most quoted living African authors, as well as one of the most distinguished thinkers in the African world and the world. He has been recognized as one of the 10 most widely cited African scholars. I could go on. He's been named a history maker with an interview in the Library of Congress. At Temple University, he created the first PhD program in African American Studies in 1988. He's the founder of the theory of Afrocentricity. Ashanti wrote also for outside of the university with a mandatory African American history course for the Philadelphia School District. And I'm delighted to hand the word to him.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you, International Congress of Aesthetics, for inviting me. And I want to also give my thanks to Rodrigo and his team. They have done an excellent job, and I can attest to you that you have many great drivers with you as well. We made it safely through the great city of Belo Horizonte. I also would like to acknowledge first one of the things that I have come to do, and that is what we call land acknowledgement. I would like to acknowledge the ancestors of the Shakuru people of this great country, whose land we are on today. I want to also do labor acknowledgement for the Yoruba and Angola and the Congo people, my ancestors, who also worked in this land, in this country. I want to also acknowledge the Portuguese, other Europeans, and the Japanese who have helped make this country great. I'm delighted for the university, staff, faculty, for having me here. I also would like to acknowledge my friend, colleague, who is one of the great examples of the conveyors of art and culture in Brazil, as well as in the United States, and that is Dr. Lisa Nascimento, who is the widow of the great Abdias Nascimento. So delighted to see you. I am asserting, and I'm going to read my paper. Richard and I were old colleagues at Temple University, but he's probably better on his feet than I am. So I'm going to read my paper, and I will make some excursions, but I would like to read it because I think it's important that you hear my argument. And also, you should know that I'm happy to be in Brazil because I cannot go to Florida. I'm banned by the governor, DeSantis, of the state of Florida. So I'm one of the writers that you can't read in Florida. So you guys can hear me. And you will see that I am also quite provocative. Maybe that's one of the reasons, but I don't intend to be provocative too much today, just to give you some of the information that I wanted to share with you. I'm asserting that the Africanist aesthetic, which is everywhere, is often invisible intellectually because of erasure or blindness in the Western world. We have had a conference in which we have talked, and we can talk about Asian aesthetics and Western aesthetics, but where is Africa? And I'm telling you, it's everywhere. That's the assertion. Like Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man, the Africanist aesthetic, though flourishing, is rarely observed in an intellectual way. Thus, I cannot ever dispense with the lived experience of Africans transgenerationally and transcontinentally, whether in 3000 BCE or in Brazil, Peru, Mexico, Ghana, Nigeria, Colombia, or the United States. I advance only an epistemic idea quite apart from Eurocentricity, that undergirds a plural African aesthetics capable of covering Africa, the Caribbean, and American continents. Our African perceptions were the first human perceptions. Since the Euro conquest, we have been disconnected, dislocated, and removed from our center position, but I am suggesting that there is a way back to the future. Beginning with classical ideas from the Nile Valley civilization, this paper will then use contemporary artists like Romano Santana, Nablius Nascimento, the Welsh Asanti, and others to reveal polyrhythms, textured layering, resplendent colors, cultural motifs, and effusive energy to demonstrate beauty and provide the source of African aesthetic values and judgment. I started at the beginning, at the earliest dawn of Homo sapiens, practicing the sapience that identifies the species. We do not have written records that are easily understood or translatable to us today, but there are markers such as Enzalo Ilanga, Napta Playa, and scores of early rock drawings and paintings of early Homo sapiens. I've seen many of these standing in the caves at Domashao, for example, in Zimbabwe, and also at Enzalo Ilanga, overlooking Mozambique from the hills of Mpumalanga in South Africa. Although we know that Alexander Baumgartner, as explained by Terry Eagleton and as mentioned by Richard Shusterman, began his discourse on aesthetics from the human body, this is simply one approach to the subject of the beautiful and the good. The way Eagleton speaks of Alexander Baumgartner's project is like this: aesthetics is born as a discourse of the body. The vital distinction the term signifies for its inventor, Alexander Baumgartner, is not between art and life, but between the material and the immaterial, between things and thoughts, sensations and ideas, what is bound up with our creaturely life of perception as opposed to what belongs to the mind. To begin with, these provisions and limitations for aesthetics have nothing to do with African culture, realities, or philosophies. The bifurcations and dualities proposed by Baumgartner's view of aesthetics confounds the problem for the African world. How can you separate the material from the immaterial? Things and thoughts and sensations and ideas. This penchant, indeed passion for separation, is at the very core of Western notions of patriarchy and hierarchy. And I might add racialist doctrines, as in the separation of and ranking of human beings and bodies based on physiology. I want you to journey with me to another world, not only one that is possible, but one that is lived by millions of First Nations people in colonized and conquered areas of the earth. Our journey is not long because it is not a place unknown to Europe or those of European ancestry. But for Europeans themselves are the descendants, of First Nations at one time and of Africans in remote times. It is a human journey based on how we have come to grasp our world. We have been educated for this journey by generations interacting with the environment and other people and our own sensations. We are not ignorant travelers, let loose on a wandering journey, unaware of our surroundings, impervious to the nature of challenges. We are fit for this journey. We must do good because that is what creates life, according to the ancient African philosophers. The antiquity of African philosophy is unique, and stands alone in its foundational dimension because its antiquity is far beyond that of other philosophies. While civilizations such as the Sumerian and Minoan produced pottery, vases, and frescoes during the period of the earliest Egyptian dynasties in the Nile Valley, only Egypt produced a body of work consistent enough in ethical, spiritual, and moral aspects to be called philosophy. It would not be until much later, nearly 2,000 years later, that the Greeks produced Homer, who gave us the Iliad and the Odyssey. An account of the earliest human thinking about the nature of the universe, human relations, good and evil, the beautiful, order and harmony, ethical behavior, the source of things, in effect, philosophy brings us as close as we can get to our intellectual origins. Here, I am not interested in the impact Africa had on Europe or ancient Egypt on Greece, but rather the description and explication of the African view of reality as presented in the writings of the earliest thinkers. This departure is necessary to wrest the study of ancient Egypt from the grip of those who see it only in relationship to Greece. The study of the language brings us the words like rek, meaning knowledge, or seba, meaning teacher, and sebayet, meaning wisdom, teachers. Reading this, and it's very interesting, teaching, I think it's very important that we understand this because in my book, Egyptian Philosophers, I have talked about this because here are philosophers who lived 2,000 years before the first philosopher of the Greek world, who was Thales. And these philosophers, their names we don't know very much today. So we never heard of Imhotep, for example, or Ptahotep, or Merikari, or Dwaf, Amenhotep, the son of Hapu. We may have heard of Akhenaten, you see. But for the most part, we don't know the ancient African philosophers. We assume that they didn't exist, and that the first philosopher had to be Thales the Greek. But Thales himself says that he studied in Africa, that that's where he got his first lesson. He told that to Pythagoras, according to Plutarch. So it's extremely important that we understand this. And we understand about erasure, and we also understand about illusion and delusion, you see? So the Greeks, on the other hand, centuries later wrote of these early African thinkers as physiologi, a name they also used to refer to the Ionians in Greece, who were considered observers of nature. But the Sebaya would have most easily related to the Greek word Sophia, which came from the African word Seba. Seba is the direct origin for the word Sophia. And this is the very beginning of our understanding of the word philosophy, because people say that philosophy means lover of wisdom. But the word for wisdom, Seba, is an African word. And sometimes when you look at the dictionary of etymology, and you're looking for the origin of Sophia, it tells you that the origin is unknown. It is not unknown. Whenever they say something is unknown, I always say it must be African. Europeans are not going to look at Africa. You know what I'm saying? It can't be African. If it's, maybe the alien didn't come from Africa. This is the way to think. Culture is the guardian of all aesthetics, and culture is the sum of the sensate, historical, social, and intuitive events. Therefore, it is nothing less than the whole of our sensate life, not to be compartmentalized as simply our wants and desires, our attractions and aversions, and how life comes to the body of it on the sensory surfaces. All around us are the evidences of the aesthetic, not in any banal sense of ranking of human bodies as good or ugly. But there's another country out there, beyond the seas and across the mountains, that must be shaking its head about the possibilities of the real and the unreal. We who are trained in the West know such little things about colors and patterns and tones and circles, and hence must be taught and retaught the same lessons with lessons. We are often the participants in our own erasure, and I mean this as terms of African people. It's true. This is possible without guidance that comes from knowledge, and knowledge allows us the ethics of consciousness. Without consciousness, anything is possible and allowable, but with consciousness, anything, with consciousness, one recognizes defeats and victories alike, because we have captured the disparate elements of our existence and piled them up like so much firewood ready to be used for cooking our meals. To speak of African aesthetics is not to speak of a separate aesthetic, but an aesthetic idea that is closest to the origin of our species. In some senses, the history of the West has been an exercise in moving away from origins. In fact, it has been about dominion, about maybe not so much dominion as domination over inferior powers. To quote Eagleton, following Baumgartner's assertion that reason is greater than aesthetics, and to show the disdain of the female speaks of reason as superior to the inferior feminine aesthetic. The hallmark of Western civilization is the act of classification of things, ideas, and people. I think it's the core of Western patriarchy and hierarchy. And classification, I need to point this out, classification is not problematic in itself, but becomes the source of deep prejudices when ranking is involved. The early African people, particularly Homo sapiens rising 300,000 years ago, I am sure found that there were other humans that were different. So difference existed. There were people who were short and tall. There were the Twa people, and then there were the Tutsi people. One was short, the other was tall. But what Africans did not do, early Homo sapiens did not do, was to rate humans on the basis of difference. This is a Western invention, and this invention of rating humans is also out of this classification where you then began to say reason is better than aesthetics, or this body is better than that body, and so forth. I shall take us back towards origins, and so in so doing, speak of harmoniousness captured in the wholeness of the cosmos. That is inclusive and revolutionary, because all this is necessary for capturing meaning. Reason is not so dissimilar from aesthetics, and one is not superior to the other in acquisition of knowledge. Reason and aesthetics are on the same continuum. Both give us productions, thoughts, and art, which are joined. Afrocentricity enters the discourse of the aesthetic with an assertion of an innovation based on adopting an African agency perspective. It is not that this perspective does not exist in practice, but rather that those who dominate the study of aesthetics have rarely advanced African agency. In fact, may never have seen it. I remember once when I was living in Zimbabwe, A.J. Ayers, who had been one of my models as a young student at the University of California, had come to Harare to give a lecture at the university at the time on the history of philosophy. And I had really loved reading his book, Language, Truth, and Logic. And so after he spoke, I stood up in the audience and I said, "You're here in the middle of Africa, you've spoken about the history of philosophy, and you have said nothing about African or African philosophy. How can this be? What is, you were one of my idols when I was in graduate school." And I was so happy because he was very gracious, and he said, "Young man, I have never studied or learned anything about African philosophy." That is the role of those, many of those in aesthetics. They don't know African aesthetics. So you don't have a conversation. And that's the biggest conversation because everywhere you look, it is. And I see it every day. And in the city I live, Philadelphia, we see it all the time. But there's an erasure. There's an intellectual erasure of African culture. And there's an intellectual erasure of African culture when we have meetings like this. So I'm very happy to be here. Y'all want to invite me again, but you will hear me this time because it's extremely important for you in advancing your work to have this understanding, you see. And as you will see, I'm working with a very stern timekeeper, so I hope I'm good. I have 2 more points that I need to make. Thank you very much. All right. And in fact, thank you. All right. For example, neither Baumgartner nor Edmund Husserl paid much attention to the primacy of African aesthetics in human history. They confronted, as Eagleton did, an aesthetic of the West, established as a universal science of subjectivity, which I find is based on the collectivity of European sensibilities. It may speak in the name of humanity, but it is Europe asserting dominance and a will to speak for all cultures and people. I have seen this, whether the dance is ballet or the music European classical. What of the dance of the Japanese, the Zulu, the Apache, the Maasai, or the New Guineans, or the Shukuru? Who speaks and frames the conversation about what is to be respected, elevated, and referenced, and what is not even in the conversation of these things? Afrocentricity is itself the ideological reconstruction that advances the possibility of a common understanding of an aesthetic grounded in an acceptance of historical elevation of African perceptions. I'm taking the war against the African episteme to the very cliff of erasure, to leap into a new whole human world. I'm very happy to announce here that the young Japanese scholar Yoshitaka Miike at the University of Hawaii is doing the same thing with Asian culture. Such a term as a whole human is not meant to convey a human body, but an inclusive collective seeking to assert the sentience of all Homo sapiens. Every body has duty. Ranking serves discrimination. Difference in natural ranking is social. And so what happens is that we have a difference, but then we understand that the very earliest creation narratives of African Nile Valley civilizations, which are the classical civilizations, said this way, do it this way, as Sheikh Abdul Jabbar once said. Egypt and Nubia are to African culture as China and India are to Asian culture, and Greece and Rome are to European culture. In other words, if you understand that, then you have some understanding of the relationship of the cultures of Africa to Nile Valley civilization, which is one of the oldest. They were imprinted in the minds of ancients and became maternal icons, repeated in various other societies. Consider briefly the pyramid, which of course, if you ask me, should be the beginning of all knowledge, not just in the West, but everywhere in the world. Because here you have, at the earliest point, the object that contains history, science, theology, literature, pyramid. That's 2,800 before the Christian era. That's almost 2,000 years before Homer. How do we start with the Odyssey and the Iliad? Even in the West, this is where we start with the Iliad and Homer. We can repeat it because we start there. But we don't start with the ancient African document, the pyramid, where you have the oldest texts, the oldest books, the most comprehensive information on chemistry and biology, physiology. Mummification was at the very core of the study of anatomy. We don't start there. We start with Homer. That's a racist interpretation of human history. Why do we start so late in terms of human beings? I want to go, and we don't discuss the Tekken, the Ankh, the Sphinx, the Bennu bird, and so forth. I'm just going to do this quickly, and I'm not going to comment. Do this quickly, all right? Do this quickly. I don't want to take up too much time. I can explain later. Okay? That's okay. That's okay. You know this. This is the Bennu bird. Okay? This is the glyph for God. The first glyph for God. All right? Okay, you know the eye of Hebrew. And this is Episteme Nascimento. He's a Brazilian artist. In my judgment, one of the greatest artists in this country. But I talked to many Brazilians, never heard of him. But anyway, erasure of an African Brazilian. Episteme Nascimento. This is all connected. African American. So, I just wanted to show you this because there are images here, and I can tell you, and I do it with my students. I teach a class sometimes called African Aesthetics. And we show people different things from different cultures. Say, is that African? And they can tell you whether or not it's African or not. And they know that they know that there's something different. I can show you Asian art and African art, and I can tell you the difference. Normally, you see. I can show you Western art, and I can show you the difference. Let me tell you something. It's necessary to expand our sensibilities toward the sentience of African cultures in order to rescue Europe from the inevitable cul-de-sac of endless commentaries on European Christian art as classical avenues for the aesthetic. I remember my visit in Madrid to the Prado. After passing its massive entry and going from one exhibition hall to another, I was exhausted with the idea that Europe's contribution to art as a form of the aesthetic was a deep religious national individualism that highlighted the characters and personalities of the Christian scriptures. My response to Prado, as to other great museums in the West, was one of disbelief. All the years that I had studied art and culture had not prepared me for the overwhelming religious nature of the exhibition. And then I understood that religion is a projection of nationalism, with various selected items, events, and personalities being honored as ritual sacredness. That is why conquerors go first for the gods to destroy society. It is not my aim to judge or to castigate any tradition of art or religion, but I will assert a place at the table of aesthetics for the African orientation based on classical African experiences and attitudes. Carrie Wells claims in her book, The African Aesthetic, Keeper of the Traditions, that a universal aesthetic that is applicable to all the arts is valid only within the context of a particular culture based on criteria derived from history and mythology. She means you have points of departure, but you recognize others. The declaration of objectivity has more to do with an insurgency against other forms of perception than anything else. It seems to hold an interdependent relationship with universality, as Carlton and Barbara Molefi see as white male privilege in philosophy and artistic circles. The idea is that the failure of the privileged class to perceive something that we Africans see is our problem, which is actually their problem. Wells writes, The nature and complexion of an aesthetic will differ from one culture to another, depending on its history and mythology, which almost always involve religion. Church and state were often divided during the European Middle Ages, and the aesthetics of the various European nations evolved freed of moral and papal pressures. Although reflecting religious themes, in the Middle East, Islam and the state have often existed as a union, thereby creating an aesthetic that reflects the dictates of Islam. In pre-colonial Africa, the concept of state was intertwined and interdependent with the traditional religion. The aesthetic reflects the union of government and traditional religion. An artist in the tradition worked for the community, and his or her task was considered a part of the divine order. An artist in African society does not view society as an impartial observer to create. Rather, society actively gives vision and perspective from which to express oneself. It is an open vision and perspective with soft parameters that permit individual expression, but simultaneously support the collective artistic expression. Distinctions between society and artists and between spectators and performers are not linear, and so rigidly separate as in the West. In traditional African society, the spectators and the artists are often one. Seeking to demonstrate that African aesthetics may have communal or ethnic creative components, Welch says that one can find commonalities in the dances of different African people. For example, family aesthetics are related by specific common characteristics while maintaining individual ethnic aesthetic identities. The Sabar dance of the Wolof people, for example, of Senegal is unquestionably Wolof. At the same time, it shares common aesthetic traits with the Gure dance of the Chopi people of Mozambique, and so forth. So there are many examples of this. Welch, as a choreographer, can make this conclusion because in discussing African dance, one must arrive at the point of seeing time, space, symbols, and myths as the proper mix to execute in Zuri. The good, the beautiful. How do you bring good and beauty into the world? One does it with a creative urge, or finds it in the world that has already been created or is being created. There exist these cultural banks containing memories, rhythms, meanings, symbols, histories, and spaces as ancient as the pyramids and Unks, predating colonization and enslavement of Africans, that are the bedrock of the aesthetic ideal. Each day we collect other experiences as one picks pebbles from the shores of lakes or shells from the ocean beaches. That's why I say it is everywhere present. Our challenge can be declared, recognized, and met on the battlefield of good intentions. But this is a great challenge because we know that battlefields are often contradictory to good intentions. What I'm suggesting is that the ideology of aesthetics must consider reducing the impression of ruthless cultural domination. In our universe, aesthetic autonomy is neither appropriate nor possible. We influence, and we are influenced. What is possible is the destruction of aesthetic hierarchy, whether in terms of geography, class, gender, or family origin. One can diminish hierarchical thinking without diminishing people. We often speak of sentient life as if there were some other type of life. All human life is sentient. The meaning of sentient is one which demonstrates a capacity for sensations and feelings. Deriving from the Latin sentire, meaning to feel or to perceive, the word sentient carries properties that are at the foundation of our human practice and behavior. When a person is said to have no feelings, but to be cold-hearted and without feeling, we sadly announce defeat. As humans, we are being sentient all the time, perceiving and feeling, moving through time and space, like a giant bubble, gathering every intimate wisp of experience to live. The word experience can mean an experience or an encounter, but in either case, it carries with it the idea of being or making an impression. The Africans who were brought here to the Americas, to Brazil, and to the United States, and the Caribbean, and to Colombia, and Mexico, and other places, and Canada, and North America, they all gathered memories. We gathered memories from the Middle Passage between Africa and America. A pathos and a history that shaped our aesthetic sensibilities. The task is one of recovery, not recreating, but knowing so as to have a usable past for a new future. When Africans in the United States say that someone has soul, for example, it means they have an ineffable essence. Whether a person is smooth or cool or fierce and preserving, to indicate that they have soul is to connect their sentient personhood and energy to the cultural spirit of the African-American experience identified in the passage from Africa to the Americas, in the cotton fields, in copper mines, and sugarcane farms, and memories of the blues and jazz and spirituals, the great master songs of our lives. In the African tradition, there are many ways to approach this thing, but one way is to understand the Yoruba term, etutu. The idea of coolness. This idea is one of transcendent attitude, but with a harmonious outcome. This is cool. It's ma'atic. As an aesthetic, it is characterized by control, order, propriety, composure, with an all-embracing aesthetic attitude deeply entrenched in the African classical tradition of Ma. The fact that we no longer use the term Ma is unfortunate, but must be placed in the corner of European philosophical and aesthetic domination. Maulana Karenga's book, Ma, the Moral Idea in Ancient Egypt, is recommended for all people. And then I'm going to skip here because I'm going to do it. I will do it. I have time. I only raise this to say that our aesthetic tradition, so prevalent in many genres of art, must always be seen in the light of our classical civilization of the Nile Valley. Yet we know that as all other cultures have their individuality, ancient Egypt was its own culture. That is, it was not the same as Nubia or the Shalak or the Shona or the Amharic or the Akan and so forth. Egypt existed within the context of its own political, geographical, and mythological world. To the degree that there are aesthetic similarities with those societies contiguous with Egypt, or to the degree that there are seemingly influences in other parts of Africa produced by devotees of the female and male priests, conquests, migrations, and so on, we are underscoring the immensity of the debt that is owed to ancient African philosophers. And their inheritance is derived from the Khoisan people, and for them, the Naledi civilization that arranged stones and drew images on cave walls. We have all inherited from them. And I will not go through the Greek word aestheticos. We already had that. I wanted to say something about Abdias Nascimento, and then try to break this. Okay. I remember the first time I saw the work of the Brazilian artist Abdias Nascimento, man of culture, was a minister in the government of Lula's first government, and one of my mentors. I had been invited to his home to have a carne and some other food that was reminded of my Yoruba ancestry, my Yoruba and Sudanese ancestry. So, walking into a large studio, I was face to face with Yansa, Obatala, Oshun, Oshosi, Yamanya, Ogun, Shango, and Eshu. Some of you know what I mean, others of you may not know these names. And I felt something like an immediate perfectibility, a resonance of soul, a coolness of spirit, and a refreshing awakening of knowledge and feeling, reason, memory of 1,000 years. I would later sit at his feet and learn from him how to approach the aesthetic that transforms. He knew that the aphis sacred bull of ancient Kemet, Kemet was the African name of Egypt before the Greeks gave it the name Egypt. You should remember that. The Greeks, this is again, domination, conquest, change your name. I'll give you a name, right? But the name is Kemet. That's what the Africans called the country of Egypt. But Nascimento knew that the aphis sacred bull of ancient Kemet and the Yoruba acts of Shango were directly connected over centuries of African responses to nature, symbols, meanings, and myths. Therein lies Nascimento's oft-remembered adage that the artist must win back the memory of the Afro-Brazilian people. And it seems to me in this conference that it's wonderful to have the International Congress of Aesthetics meeting here in Brazil, the 22nd conference meeting here, because it allowed me an opportunity to come and to pay homage to the man who I think did most for bringing African Brazilian art to North America, as well as he has done here in Brazil itself. I think he's probably better known in New York and Philadelphia and Buffalo than he's known in Brazil. But that is because we've lost our memory. And I hope that by me speaking here, we will help to regain memory. And I'm going to end by saying that it was Akhenaten who said, every land is in festivity. And we should always know that, as the ancient African philosopher Akhenaten, recognizing that every land is in festivity, we should also be in festivity. The god Aton, from which we got the word Athens and Athena, had no great mythology or theology and could convey no sense of the awe that one was struck with when in the presence of our men. For our men, like Ptah and Atum and Ra, had depth and national reach unknown to Aten, because those great gods reached back into the mystic past and brought our imaginations into a futuristic realm where we stand now perched on a mountaintop of aesthetic recovery. I want to thank you, and I do have a few papers. They're unedited, but I do have some. And if anyone needs to contact me, you can. Thank you. Well, I certainly will not report you to the FBI. The Florida. The FBI, I'm okay with the FBI. It's DeSantis in Florida. I'm okay. Thank you.
May I make a short?
Yes.
We're going to move
To questions? Thank you.
I'm sure we can have
Thank you.
Yes.
We could have a quick interlude first,
Yeah, this is-
and then that will maybe give Richard time to join us for the question period.
Thank you so
The
much.
question period is
I appreciate it very much. And I'm very happy to be here, and I don't think it's a coincidence that we are here with Molefi Asante on this day, at a time when at KEYNOTE, very near, we have an exhibition about Dias Nascimento's work focusing on the time that he was in exile. And I am here, I think, in part as a witness. In 1980, Abdias Nascimento published his book, Quilombismo, and in the same year, Molefi Asante published his work, Afrocentricity. They were born together, these two philosophies coming out of African experience in the diaspora. And I think that everything that Molefi said today can be very, very important for all of us at a time when we need to rescue the world from the damage that has been done by the European and American imperialist aggression against the world. And I am very happy to bring some news to Professor Asante and to all of you, which is that right now in Berlin, at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, the House of Cultures of the World, which is a monument to sort of the modern American domination, because it was built, it's a huge, beautiful monument to modernity built on during the Marshall Plan as part of the resurrection of Germany after the war. And it has been turned now to the direction of a curator from Cameroon, Bonaventure So Beijing Ndikong, who is transforming that space to, in fact, a world culture forum. And he opened with the exhibition called Quilombismo, which features 6 works by Abdias Nascimento, one of them being one that was shown by Molefi. And when Molefi speaks of arriving in the room and seeing Yansan, Oshun, Iemanjá, Ogum, Yeshu, all in one place, he's referring to one of the works by Abdias that is now in Berlin, at the Theogony, the Afro-Brazilian Theogony. So I am bringing these 2 books, and what he has done, what Ndikong has done, is shown how Afrocentricity and Quilombismo are the essence of a way to see a new world for the global South and all of its diaspora. Because he brings, under the concept of Quilombismo, he brings in people from all over the world, particularly the global South. We have Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, many countries in Africa, Asia, India. We have the Dalits. So it is an amazing exhibition, and I would love to invite Professor Asante and all of you to see it. But right now I have the pleasure of bringing to Professor Asante and offering him.
Thank you so much for that spontaneous intervention, which is in the spirit of the conference. Now we'll move to questions to both speakers. So Richard, will you join us, which would be great. And are you going to, Anna will actually do the work. I'm just And all anyone asking a question, we'd like them to come up to the front because this is being broadcast, as it were, or at least will be available. Where should go?
There's better.
Like this side,
Yeah,
apparently. It's not completely flexible. You have to be on the right side.
Well, I want to thank you, both of you, for the talking, and it's a commentary and to Professor Asanti. Well, I always I studied philosophy since graduation and master doctor, and I have never heard about Imhotep. The first time I heard about Imhotep, it was when I was curating in a short film festival here in Belo Horizonte, and I came across a short movie, experimental short movie, very good one, with the music of the great jazz musician Saha. And then I had to comment that movie, and it was really spectacular. And I had to go to Google to research who was Imhotep. And I think most of people here doesn't know who Imhotep is. That great mathematician, engineer, and one of the first philosophers from Egypt. And just another comment. In my thesis, I was researching Irish painter Francis Bacon. And in his interviews, he said, one of my greatest influences is exactly Egyptian art. And then I started researching art history for Egypt from Austrian historian Hegel. And he says about the low relief, the idea of the low relief from the Egyptian art and how it was very necessary for modern art inclusive, because of the concept of the haptic, that is not the optic and not the tactile, but both of them in the same time. So, and another thing that I came across was a hieroglyphical symbol that's called Ka. It's like two arms, like this. Yes. And it symbolizes the body and the soul at the same time. I mean, it's a kind of Platonism there, before Plato. So I was very touched by your talking, because I have never. It took so many years to understand the influence of Egyptian thinking for us.
Thank you. Obrigado. It is your profound statement, and thank you so much. Imhotep was the builder of the first pyramid. And this is 2800 BC, before the Christian era. Even when Jesus Christ was born, the Egyptian civilization was old, it was ancient, you see. And we haven't lived 2800 years this side of Jesus Christ's history. So when people talk about Christianity and religion, the African imprint is so deep and so deeply regarded. The Harvest Song, which was one of the themes that Imhotep wrote. He was, of course, as the gentleman said, was an engineer, but he was a physician. He was the first medical doctor, and he was the first actual human personality that we know of in the history of the world, outside of the legends of things like Adam and Eve and things like that. The first human multidimensional personality in the world was Imhotep, a black man. And I have to say, like Sheikh Abdul Joe always said, you have to say black, otherwise people get confused. They think Egyptians or Arabs. But this is a black man from Egypt. The Arabs came to Egypt in the 7th century, this era. Egypt was a black civilization. The farther back you go, the blacker it is. See? So that's one thing to remember. But the other thing that the gentleman said is about the art. But not only did the people who studied in Egypt, people, for example, like Homer, like Herodotus, people like Plato, Pythagoras, and Thales, not only did they study in Egypt, but they also learn of the artistic developments. One of the one friend of mine who teaches at Howard University said that when he was in the American Army, he happened to go to the Parthenon. And when he was in the Parthenon, he asked himself, wow, this is old. And then he went to Egypt, and he went to Karnak, the temple of Karnak. And he said he couldn't believe that the temple of Karnak had been started in 2700 BCE, and the Parthenon was just like 500 BC. He said, this is like 2,200 years older than the Parthenon. And I said, yes, the Parthenon is based on the principles that had already been developed artistically and architecturally in the Nile Valley civilizations, you see. So there are many things. I mean, we could go on forever talking about the development of medicine, astronomy, law, and so forth. These are all very, very much related. I've written 100 books, and one of my books is called The History of Africa. If you're interested in this subject, I have quite a section in the book, The History of Africa, on this section.
So, we'd like to invite other questions to either and both of the speakers. So, you're probably just so overwhelmed with all of the ideas that it's taking a bit of time to percolate, but let's see, it is percolating indeed. So.
I'd like to thank both professors for the talk. My first question is for the last talk, because as a professor in University in Brazil, I teach mainly to undergrad students who will be teachers in schools. And when we start, how we say in English, syllabus to teach, nowadays, every day, we are more interested in including non-Western philosophy in our syllabus, but we don't have enough material in Portuguese. And that's a very big problem, I think, because our students cannot read in English. Many of them cannot do it. And so it seems that the problem is not only in the level of bringing historical and philosophical knowledge about Africa, Asia, and so on, and also, of course, Latin America, but to transform it into a material that we can use to teach. And sometimes I think that as scholars, we are not doing good didactic work, and I'm talking much more about myself and my colleagues in Brazil. And so it's not a question, but it can be. I mean, what can you tell us about it, especially considering your experience in the United States, where I think people are writing about it and propagating materials about it?
Yes. I would like to just say that, and give honor here to Richard Shusterman, because he hired two of the best African-American philosophers when he was at Temple. And one of them is a very good friend of mine, and his name is Lewis Gordon. And Lewis Gordon has written a book which really should be translated into Portuguese, which is called An Introduction to African Philosophy by Lewis Gordon, G-O-R-D-O. You met him. He has written an incredible book that would be very useful.
May I give just a piece of information, Adriano? In Portuguese, we have a series of which I was honored to be the editor, called Sankofa, the Matriz Africana da Cultura Brasileira. And it's 4 volumes, the first having to do with the issues that Professor Asante that you were asking about, and also Pan-Africanism. The second volume speaks specifically to the issue of education and the evolution of approaches to bringing African influence and information about African civilization to the schools. The third is about women, African women, religious tradition, and environmentalism, né? Mulher guerreiras de natureza, mulher negra, religiosidade e ambiente. And the fourth one, I must say, is one that I had the honor of bringing Professor Asante's Afrocentricity to Brazil in Portuguese. So the fourth volume of the Sankofa collection is available for your work.
Thank you.
Just while other people get ready to ask more questions, I'm going to take advantage of my position here. I hope that's not an entire abuse of power, but I want to put this question to Professor Shusterman. Thinking about the goals now, and you mentioned the duality or ambiguity of the relationship between yourself and the gold man, which seems like a really interesting aspect of this work. So if I could just take up your three main dimensions you mentioned, it certainly looks good. I wonder, did it feel good? And I assume from what you said that it felt good some of the time, not all of the time. But I also wondered, in a more perhaps serious way, is did it qualify as an ameliorative experience for you? Because that's an important part of what you've talked to us about.
It was a transformative experience. There's a book about it. Actually, I brought a copy here, but there's no time to do the narration. But actually, it connects with something that I experienced indirectly through my earlier work on rap music and hip hop. That's how I came to Brazil. That is African diasporic movement. And that involves also the topic of possession. In other words, not owning something, but being possessed by a spirit. And that, the first Western theory of art and aesthetic experience is in Plato's Ion, where he talks about Ion the Rhapsody and his ability to declaim Homer. But Socrates argues that it's not through any knowledge, but being possessed by the muses. And that actually art is not a matter of knowledge, but it's a matter of divine possession and divine madness. And for Socrates and Plato, that's not good. But for other cultures, it's not so bad. It's not so bad to be possessed by something outside your individual self. And because of my work in hip hop and the Caribbean culture, where the idea of possession and voodoo goes back to West African roots, I could understand it as someone who danced and went to clubs. I also understand being out of my mind, but I never had the full experience until I broke out of that dark dungeon and broke into the sunlight and felt I wasn't myself anymore. So the answer is, there's a difference between the man in gold and in the novella, the graphic novella that describes his adventures. It's very careful in terms of literary devices that there's Richard Shusterman and the man in gold, and they don't come together. So the man in gold does stuff that I, as a philosopher, note. His behavior, you see my clothes are not, The other thing that's great about the man in gold, which is also a challenge to our self-absorbed sense of individual autonomy. The man in gold only exists when Jan and I are together. All of us, we think we're on our own, but we don't have that autonomy. We live together through a network, and we need to respect that. So, because of that experience, I have a new vision of what aesthetic experience is, powerful aesthetic experience, which is a kind of experience of possession. So there's a paper, a long paper on aesthetic experience and the powers of possession. I won't get into it now, but there are two ways of understanding this possession. One of them is theological and supernatural, and I don't discount that. But for my colleagues, to show that I can walk the walk of an Anglo-American philosopher, even though, my identity is actually hybrid. I wanted to give a naturalistic account of what it is to be possessed. And very briefly, that naturalistic account deals with two concepts. One is the concept of habit and entrenched incorporation of behavior. So I'm a philosopher, but works a lot with artists. So the art world and what art is not something that you just immediately understand. You need to get into it. And in getting into it, you learn all kinds of habits, how to pay attention, how to look at artworks, how to dance in different ways if you're into the arts of dance. So the thing about possession is interesting. It's both outside and inside. You feel you're taken by a force that's beyond you, but that force then is inside you. So the habits we get from society, from our world, they're both outside us, but they're incorporated into us. The other thing, that's one concept, and we all have art world habits, and I had an art world habit, and that's how the possession could take place. But not with that habit alone, because I had that habit all the time. The other important feature is atmosphere. So atmosphere is something that only recently philosophers and aesthetics have started talking about. But it is something that's very important. And it's something important both for itself, but also because it breaks the silly dichotomy between objective and subjective, inside and outside. Because atmosphere is both in this room, but in each of us as an individual. So atmosphere is also something that's outside, but inside possession. And that was a magical atmosphere. Royaumont, it could never happen here, right? Because we're in the classroom. This is why back in the 90s and late 80s, when I was working on hip hop, I could never play the music in a classroom. Because the classroom, it doesn't sound the same. People aren't in the mood, and mood is something important. And so what happened in Royaumont, it had that magical religious atmosphere. And then what happens again, to go back to your question, and I'm sorry for being long, I hope I'm coherent, is that together it overcame the boundaries of who I was and led me to something else, someone else. And the value in it, when we go back to the Müllerism, is, as I understand philosophy as a way of life, it's about working on oneself and on the wider society with which the self is engaged and on which the self depends. Now, one of the ways you work on yourself is by overcoming the limits and boundaries of the self. Part of those boundaries are boundaries and limits of knowledge that sometimes aren't our fault. It's because of our teachers and the educational system. And so, but another part of the boundaries that enclose the self and that also help perpetuate oppressive regimes, because we're all trained to control ourselves in ways that we've been taught to that support those oppressive regimes, is to overcome your sense and limits of personal identity, of being who you are, of being a responsible philosopher, roughly from the West and the Middle East. I mean, again, these things are more complicated. And opening yourself to something different. So that kind of loosening of boundaries of self and limits of self that put the self in question is a very important existential philosophical lesson that I could not have learned without the man in gold. And that's why he continues. That's why, you know, in March in New York on St. Patrick's Day, he went out and met the people and noticed the different mentalities in different parts of New York. And so that for me is, you know, an improvement, even if it's an improvement that involves self-questioning. And I think we all have to be ready and brave enough to question our limits. And it's something that we're not very much encouraged to do, I'm afraid, in our academic lives. And that's why, you know, the man in gold won't appear here. But he will be happy.
But we want to see.
Well, but he'll be happy to appear outside. But you'll have to invite now.
And it's important that the man in gold is happy.
No, I mean, I think the point is, I don't know if the man in gold is happy. But I know that I never want to do it. But then it's somebody else who does it.
That's it.
And I'm always happy when it's over. The man in gold rides my body. The way in the voodoo tradition, the spirits ride the person's body.
Thank you.
One more.
We've just got,
Go ahead,
So
go
we-
ahead.
we-
Yeah, please.
we've just got time for our last question now before the coffee break.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to comment a question. But first of all, thank you, Richard, for the talk, and Asante, Professor Asante, for your talk. Just one suggestion: you should hire Golden Man for. You know, like because you were speaking a lot about. We are everywhere. It is aesthetics is everywhere. Aesthetics is everywhere. But you need someone like him, you know, to promote. Anyway, what I wanted to ask, because you, first, you, Professor Asanti, you mentioned several times that African aesthetics started before, let's say, before this Western aesthetics. Can we see some similarities between them, or you know, like because if we start thinking about Asian aesthetics, there's another notion of beauty.
Yes.
Another, you know, experiences that form these theories and so on. And I wanted to ask Richard if there are any, was you thinking about the connection Somaesthetics, everyday life, everyday aesthetics, which is very popular now, and partly you answered this question, but you mentioned habits and so on. So can we like find this connection and work on them? I'm speaking as one of the founders of EVA network, Everyday Aesthetics Network, founded last year in Sicily. So these are my two questions. Similarities.
Okay, yes, I think my answer is pretty short. Yeah, my answer should be pretty short here. The idea is that the origin of Homo sapiens is the continent of Africa, number one. Just take that as a first thing. All of us are Africans in that sense. There are 8 billion people in the world. They're all derived from African source, according to science. So that's number one. The Homo sapiens spent at least 230,000 years in Africa before there was ever any migration of Homo sapiens out of Africa. And Homo sapiens didn't migrate out of Africa until about 70 or 80,000 years ago, when the migration out of Africa. Otherwise, there's been migration in Africa throughout the continent. That's why we have more diversity in Africa than in any other continent. So the notion of the West is a relatively recent notion that probably can be attributed to at least the first order, Charles Martel, organizing the people to fight against the Moorish invasion of the Moorish invasion is actually the Islamic invasion, including many converts in North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula. And then, so that's the Battle of Poitiers, I think, around, my dates may be wrong, but around 742 or something like that. So then you began to have the emergence of a notion of the West in a deeper way after the conquest of Constantinople by the Turks in the 15th century, when it became Istanbul, and then there was a definite notion of the West. So when I say that Africans laid the foundation, the very basic foundations of how we respond to the environment, to nature, to shelter, to danger, all these kinds of things had already been laid 230,000 years before we ever left the continent of Africa. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that in terms of comparison, in terms of things that are similar, yes, there are many things that are similar, but the basic concept, for example, I told you about Prado going to the museum, or any museum in the Western world. And I said, you see all these drawings of Christ on the cross and every kind of thing about the apostles and the disciples of Jesus and all that. Well, that structure had already been made, and now that is civilizations. I mean, the ancient Egyptian art on the walls of the temples and in the tombs, it was similar to that. So the idea of the theology being expressed, you see, Abdias Nascimento's work with Shango and Eshu and Yamaja is the same thing. Yeah, you see, the pattern was laid very early in Nile Valley civilizations, and it's been basically consistent in terms of how art at least perform, at least at the artistic level.
So we'll hand over to Richard, who's going to prepare us for our coffee break.
Well, yeah, but first I'll answer that question, but I'd like to say something about 20th century art. Picasso went back to African masks, so we wouldn't have contemporary art or modern art without Africa. So some people, the sensitive ones, realize the power of African culture and the fact that the West needed it to sustain and advance its own energies. That's also true with Alain Locke, another Philadelphian, who wrote in The New Negro and other essays about how the West needs the energy and vitality and tradition of Africa to survive itself as a progressive culture. Unfortunately, we haven't heard those messages properly. Okay, so that's, that's one thing. And I have to say, when I was chair of the philosophy department at Temple, through the city council, I had the Alan Locke Day declared because, he was a graduate of Central High School. Alan Locke, he's a Philadelphia.
I know he's.
That's right. So we honored him with a special day from the city council. Now I'll go back to everyday aesthetics. So pragmatist aesthetics was the source of some aesthetics, and already in pragmatist aesthetics, people made the connection to everyday aesthetics. Yeah. So in the Oxford Companion to Aesthetics, Crispin Sartwell, a very good philosopher, he did the article Aesthetics of the Everyday. He talked about my work on hip hop as an example of everyday aesthetics. Now, the man in gold is not everyday, right? It's not everyday, and I like everyday aesthetics, but I have two concerns. One of them is the worry about compartmentalization. My work in pragmatist aesthetics was to break aesthetics out of the compartmentalization of art and connect art and life. When everyday aesthetics is focused as a field, unconnected with art, then it runs the danger of another compartmentalization, another dualism. So I'm worried about going from obsessive focus on art to obsessive focus on everyday life and not seeing the continuity between them. Okay, that's one concern. The second concern is there's a lot about the everyday that really sucks. And one thing, we talk about it and we suffer it, but one way of legitimating all the horrible things in the everyday is looking for the beauty, right? And so I have a concern that T.W. Adorno once mentioned about the prisoner who loves his cell because there's nothing else for him to love, right? And so part of the melioristic dimension of pragmatist aesthetics is not to just find what's nice or interesting in the everyday, but to transform the everyday. Now, and I know that there are strands and within the everyday aesthetics that goes that melioristic way. And I won't go into it here, but that's, I guess, enough to end the session, which I
thank both speakers for what I think we will all agree were transformative experiences.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we got to make it.